Jack Miller Censor is also responsible for those pocket constitutions at the front door. They want them all gone by the time you guys leave, so please make sure to take them. 230 years ago today, our Constitution was signed by its authors and delivered to the states to be voted on. It's kind of funny that we picked September 17th as the day to celebrate the Constitution because, of course, we don't think the Constitution became valid by being signed by 39 guys in Philadelphia. It only became valid when it was ratified. And that is my excuse for talking today about something that's not at all in the original Constitution. But was very much part of the political process by which it got ratified by the states, namely the First Amendment, which many Americans now see as at least of equal importance to many parts of the Constitution. Every couple of years, somebody suggests abolishing the Electoral College, and we talk about that, but can you imagine anybody ever saying out loud that we should abolish the First Amendment? It's basically unthinkable. Is this working, by the way, in the back? Can everybody hear that? Back there? Good. There are 5 clauses in the First Amendment, and they cover 2 basic themes: freedom of religion, the Establishment and Free Exercise Clause, and freedom of speech, if I can use the word speech broadly to include the press and the right to publicly protest. People sometimes say the First Amendment is about one thing that they call freedom of thought. They want to lump these different ideas into one category. I want to talk today about why I think that's a mistake. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion are 2 quite different things, both crucial to the functioning of our republic, but in different ways, and I think we have to treat them differently in order to preserve both. I'll start with freedom of speech. Not all speech is verbal. We know this. You can go to a rally and play "We Shall Overcome" on a guitar, even if no one sings along. You can hold up pictures outside of an abortion clinic, even if you don't say anything. You can draw a political cartoon without a caption. These are obviously covered by the First Amendment. And so people sometimes prefer to say freedom of expression instead of saying freedom of speech. That's fine as far as it goes, as long as it doesn't give anybody the impression that it somehow means we all have the inherent right just to express whatever happens to be inside of us whenever we feel it. The real reason we have free speech is quite different from that. And you see it right in the first book of the Iliad, which shows, I believe, the first deliberative assembly depicted in Western literature. The whole army is suffering. They need to figure out what's wrong. They can only figure it out if people speak their mind freely. And so Achilles, who's not the king, says, "You're not going to get in trouble for what you say here. I'll defend your freedom of speech, even if it's something against the king." A similar argument was made by St. Thomas More, speaking to his king as Speaker of the House and petitioning for freedom of speech in Parliament. Again, the argument is, running a country is hard. We need everyone's honest input if we're going to have half a chance of doing it well. So we can't have people punished for contributing that honest input, even if what they say is unpopular, and especially if it's unpopular with the rich and powerful. That's the argument for freedom of speech in a republic. Every citizen has the right and obligation to contribute to our common deliberations about the good and the bad, the just and the unjust, and we need to give everybody a wide leeway to make those contributions without fear. And so there are perfectly logical limits to free speech. Slanderous speech doesn't contribute to our deliberations about anything. Fighting words tend to stop deliberation rather than advancing it. Seditious speech can undermine the Republican government itself. These limits are necessary, but we know there are exceptions to the rule. The rule in a healthy republic is that we should all be allowed, as much as possible, to say anything that could plausibly contribute to our common deliberations about how to run the country. Freedom of religion is a very different case. We protect freedom of speech because we want speech to remain at the center of our political activity. We protect freedom of religion in part because we want religion not to be at the center of our political activity. By which I mean that we can only have freedom of religion if religious questions, as a rule, are not what politics is about. Freedom of religion means, among other things, we try to avoid having our law take sides on religious controversies. We have no religious tests for office. We have no government-supported church. And our citizens are, in the words of Washington, responsible only to their maker for their religion or modes of faith, since our government requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. It's not the government's business to tell you how to believe or how to worship. So again, we have freedom of speech because we want people to talk about anything that could be on the table while we're making laws. We have freedom of religion in part because, as much as possible, we don't want religion to be on the table when we're making laws. If you ask people why not, why don't we want religion to be what our laws are about, I think you'll get different and contradictory ideas from different Americans. So I'll just point out one answer that I think we can all agree on. Something like this arrangement of religious freedom was almost certainly necessary as soon as we decided to become one extended republic instead of just 13 confederated states. Because the Constitution that we're celebrating today made us into, as far as I know, only the second religiously diverse republic in human history. The first one being Holland, which was where religious freedom had more or less been invented in the 17th century. If we're allowed to make laws about religion, and if the rulers are divided on questions of religion, it's a recipe for civil war. And in a republic, we're all the rulers. So it was clear from the time of our founding that if this experiment in self-government was ever going to work in a religiously pluralistic society, we would have to find some way of keeping our religious differences from turning into political differences, which meant keeping religious questions more or less out of politics. I want to add a caveat. When I talk about us being so religiously pluralistic, I mean compared to earlier republics, Rome, Athens, Sparta, Venice, even England. In absolute terms, we've never been as religiously diverse as we sometimes like to pretend, and perhaps for that reason, it's also never been quite true that religion is off the table when we make laws. The vast majority of American believers have always been Christians. A significant majority have always been Protestants. And even today, only 5 or 6% of Americans identify with any non-Christian religion. Those 5 or 6% of people would be happy to tell you that they are quite aware of living in a country whose laws have in fact been shaped by Western Christianity. Christmas and Easter Monday are federal holidays. Western Easter, by the way, not Orthodox Easter. Government offices and many businesses are closed on Sunday, which is kind of a pain if you want to get some work done on Sunday so you have time to go to synagogue on Saturday or mosque on Friday. For most of our history, taxpayer-funded schools taught the Bible, the Protestant Bible, not the Catholic one. And they had students recite what they called the Lord's Prayer, the Lord, of course, being Jesus. And Americans talk about God all the time in our legal documents, our patriotic songs, public events, public oaths, our Declaration of Independence, all sorts of important places in our civic life. Now, talking about God may not be a problem for Jews or Muslims since they're monotheists. But most of the world was not monotheist in 1787. Almost half the world isn't monotheist now. In some ways, our laws really do take sides on some controversial religious questions. And we've never tried to keep religious claims entirely out of our political and legal decisions. We've just tried to do it as much as possible. And religious freedom, our American version of religious freedom, is how we've tried to do that. To repeat, the reason, or at least a reason, is that we want to avoid civil conflicts based on religion. We want to avoid everything bad that can happen to a country, and to a religion for that matter, when religion and politics become too closely intertwined, or when religious disputes become political disputes. And that's one thing that makes religious freedom different from freedom of speech. Freedom of religion was designed to protect us from the potential political dangers of religion. Freedom of speech was never designed to protect us from any political dangers of speech. Religious disagreement poses a unique threat to civic cohesion, and religious freedom is a unique attempt to manage that threat. So one difference between freedom of speech and freedom of religion is that freedom of religion is in part a response to certain dangers that only religion poses. I think that's only half the story. We also need religious freedom in order to secure certain goods that only religion can bring us as a country. And I mean goods for politics. I'll quote Washington again. "The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish these goods." Religious institutions provide the US with important political benefits. And we grant religious freedom to those institutions in order that they can flourish and be themselves and continue to provide those benefits for all of us. We think it would be a great shame if those institutions ever had to close their doors. And religious freedom is our attempt to avoid forcing them to ever do that. What kind of benefits am I talking about? I'll give a short list, which will be far from exhaustive. I picked this particular list because I found these all listed in St. Augustine, in his descriptions of the tasks that he says the church performs and that even secular government ought to appreciate. So see if these sound familiar 1,600 years later. Augustine says that the church feeds the hungry. She accompanies the lonely. She comforts the dying and the grieving. She helps the addicted. She gives aid to widows and orphans. She shelters refugees. She works to strengthen the bonds of fellowship between neighbors and citizens. She works especially to strengthen family bonds, and above all, the marriage bond. She does this because those bonds need strengthening, because human frailty makes them weak, and yet on them depends the strength of our whole country, generation after generation. In wartime, the church does whatever she can to remind hostile nations of the brotherhood of all men and of our common need to work for peace, and to alleviate at least a few of the unavoidable brutalities of the battlefield. In peacetime, the church works with criminals and pleads with judges to soften the harshness that so often accompanies all earthly justice. Thus far, Augustine. I don't think I need to tell anyone that American churches and religious institutions have been doing all that since before we had a constitution. They've never done it perfectly, God knows. They too are run by human beings. But it is hard to claim that our country would be a happier place, a healthier place, a brighter place, a freer or more moral place, if our religious institutions hadn't been making these invaluable contributions to our civic life. I'm not even done the list yet. Religious institutions also inculcate the morality that our country needs in order for it to run well, or that our civic life needs in order for our country to run well. Historically, not every human religion has always taught the kind of moral lessons that make people into good citizens. But nearly every American religion today does, except for the most marginal cults and fringe groups. Our religious communities help communicate healthy moral lessons to children and the young, and then once a week they bring together both young and old and remind them again of those same moral lessons, because frankly, human nature really needs the reminders. These moral lessons are essential to the American way of life. Look at how people behaved in Houston a couple weeks ago. Boating around for days to rescue total strangers and the pets of total strangers. Forming human chains, helping each other in all kinds of amazing ways, and also putting a quick stop to looters, of whom there were very few to begin with. Look, to take one contrast, at how so many executives on Wall Street were behaving 10 years ago and what led to our financial crisis and the Great Recession. The first one makes us proud to be Americans. The second poses a serious threat to the stability of our republic. Does anyone seriously doubt which of these two types of behavior is being encouraged by the vast majority of American religious institutions? Does anyone seriously wonder which of the two we're likely to see more of when those religious institutions weaken? Our political life only works when our social and economic life are informed by the moral lessons that Americans get from their religious institutions. And from other places too, by the way, but the religious institutions play a very important role. And there are ways that religion affects political life more directly. Power corrupts. Not always, I know, but very often it does. Political leaders, almost by definition, need extra reminders if they're going to behave morally. And throughout our history, Americans have been giving them those reminders, rocking our politics with wave after wave of moral reform movements, of which every single one, prior to the gay rights movement of the 90s, had gotten its start in American churches. Abolitionism, prohibition, the social gospel, the civil rights movement. Again, not a perfect record. I'm not a supporter of the prohibition movement. But I think most Americans would agree that, taking it all together, our country would be a worse place without the political contributions of American churches. Religious morality also has a direct effect on our political discourse. It encourages charity towards your fellow Americans, and I mean charity in the most minimal, non-Christian sense of the word. It encourages civility, or minimal respect for the person you disagree with, which is crucial to running a healthy republic. Not all religious people do a great job of this by any means, but it's not an accident. And you see both liberal and conservative journalists pointing this out in 2017. It's not an accident that today, the Americans who are having most trouble being civil to their political opponents are, in general, the same groups of people who are most alienated from institutional religion, whether it's the radically secular left or the nationalist, post-Christian right or alt-right. And one more major contribution that religion makes to our political life. It teaches citizens to recognize their duties to their country as sacred. It teaches me to think of service to my country, up to and including giving my life for my country, as not just an annoying trade-off that I may be forced to accept, not just an unavoidable part of a contract that I had to sign in order to secure my own comfortable self-preservation, but rather as a sacred obligation that will be part of what I'm judged on when I die. Now, the US has an interesting way of teaching that duties to our country are sacred without actually invoking any particular religion, because we have a whole set of practices that are often called our civil religion. And I referred to a few of them before. We invoke God whenever public servants take the oath of office. We pray at the opening of legislatures and courts, also at presidential inaugurations. We mention God in the Declaration of Independence, the Pledge of Allegiance, on our currency, and in practically every major speech a president makes. We have a holiday called Thanksgiving, in which we're supposed to thank God for our country and its blessings. Military chaplains are full-time federal employees, and if you go to a military funeral, or even a military retirement ceremony, secular agnosticism is not what you're going to hear there from the men and women who take up arms to defend our American Constitution. The God who is invoked in all of these public settings is not, as I said, the God of any particular religion. He's generic. He's a creator. He endowed us with our rights. He watches over the U.S. He will bless us if we do right. He will judge us if we do wrong. Again, these are not self-evident or universally accepted theological claims, but they're not exactly the Nicene Creed either. The God of American civil religion is not uniquely the God of any particular American religion. The generic God of American civil religion is also a God that virtually nobody believes in. Freemasons may be the interesting exception here. I'm not quite sure what to do about that. But for the most part, real Americans who hear the word God in the oath of office, say, are thinking about God as the Protestant Bible describes him, or God as Catholic scripture and tradition describe him, or God as described in the Tanakh and the Talmud, or the Quran and the Hadith, and so on. The general phrases, the generic phrases that we hear at public events about our Creator and divine providence and what have you, these are like placeholders. And the Americans who listen to them have always filled them in, each with our own particular theological understanding that we've learned from our education in our own religious traditions. In other words, even American civil religion has always presupposed and drawn its strength from living, breathing religions that teach something fuller and richer than the least common denominator theology of the Declaration of Independence. From all this I conclude. If we're interested in preserving Republican self-government, protecting religion is not as immediately and obviously necessary as protecting speech, but in the long run it's at least as important. One thing religion and speech have in common is we don't actually think that every act of speech or every religious observance in this country is directly contributing to our political common good. We just think that we're better off overall when speech and religion are allowed to flourish rather than being suppressed by whoever happens to be in government. But I want to emphasize now the practical differences between how they need to be protected. For one thing, religion is by definition exclusive in a way speech isn't. Any American can pick up a newspaper, read an article written by a stranger they know nothing about, and walk away persuaded. Not any American can walk into a Catholic Mass and receive communion. Religion separates us more than speech does. To say we are a religiously pluralist country means, by definition, that we are divided into smaller groups, each of which believes and does some things that the rest of the country is going to think, in some way, are at least a little bit weird. Every religious sect is united by something that they don't fully share with others. They're united by common beliefs, common worship, and common moral views about how they ought to act in public beyond the four walls of their religious buildings. And I want to emphasize that last point about the moral views. If there were a religious group that had no particular moral teachings, if all they had to offer was some dogmas, some speculative dogmas, and some particular forms of worship, they wouldn't ask for any specifically religious freedom. All they'd need would be freedom of speech. And arguably, we'd have no reason to give them religious freedom. They would neither pose the political threats nor offer the political benefits that religious freedom tries to secure and avoid in the other order. On the other hand, I doubt there ever will be such a religion. I doubt that humans can speak about the divine without in some way addressing our natural desire for justice, our love of neighbor, and our desire for a rightly ordered society. That just seems to me how humans work. But if I'm right about that, then freedom of religion, unlike freedom of speech, has to include the freedom not just to preach and to worship, but also to hold and act on moral views that make you different from most of your fellow citizens and that affect your behavior in public. In practical terms, what that means is that freedom of religion has to mean we sometimes grant people exemptions from perfectly valid laws when they have a conscientious objection to those laws. And there's no equivalent to that in freedom of speech. Americans, from Washington and Jefferson to Obama and Trump, have always believed that some such exemptions should be made. The only question has been, where do we draw the line? And it's sometimes a hard line to draw. You obviously can't just allow people to disobey whatever law they say they don't like. Historically, I think in our best moments, we've tried to look at individual cases and do a kind of balancing act. We look at this particular religious group that's asking for some conscientious exemption, and we say, Well, are they making the kind of valuable contributions to the public good that would make us say it's worth giving these people a break every once in a while? Are they, on the whole, teaching their adherents to be better American citizens? Also, how big a deal is this exemption? Do we really want Quakers serving in the army anyways? Do we really want Catholic hospitals to get sold to for-profit companies that will provide abortions, but will also make our nation's healthcare even more coldly corporate than it already is? And so on. This balancing act will always be more complicated for freedom of religion than it is for freedom of speech, because we have way more laws that regulate actions than laws that regulate speech. And so religious freedom, as compared with freedom of speech, has much greater potential for conflict with our legal system, more need for accommodation, and more of a need to draw a line before accommodations turn into anarchy. I'm not here to say exactly how all that should work in practice, so I'll say only one more thing about it. In order for our accommodations not to turn into anarchy, they have to be relatively rare. If lots of Americans had religious objections to being photographed for their driver's licenses, or to blood transfusions, or to paying taxes, or to military service, or to monogamy, or to hearing God invoked by politicians of questionable moral character, or any other number of things that are generally part of the American way of life, then it would be a lot harder to maintain our religious freedom. On the whole, this hasn't been a problem, because most American religions, most of the time, have taught roughly the same moral views, and those rules were roughly reflected in American law, with a few glaring exceptions that have related especially to slavery and its long aftermath. Do we still have that broad moral consensus among American religions today? In many ways, I would say yes. On racial issues, I think we have much more than we did, say, 60 years ago. On other issues, it's eroded, especially on issues of sexual morality and the many public policies that relate to it. That's a problem for our country. Religious freedom as we know it has worked well because it didn't have to be invoked too often. It's sort of like an insurance policy. It's great to have, it prevents some catastrophes, but you can only make so many claims before the premiums start to rise until eventually you can't afford the policy anymore. In the long run, you can only afford to buy insurance if you know you're not going to have to use it too often. And that requires you to be pretty good at avoiding risks in the first place. So if religious freedom is like an insurance policy, our national moral consensus is like the preemptive risk reduction that allows us to afford the policy. Now, if we've lost some of that moral consensus today, I'm not saying there's anything we can do to bring it back, but we certainly can work to hold on to the moral consensus that we still have. And again, I think if you compare us to other countries, we have a lot left to hold on to. Our separate religious communities could be doing a lot more to work together on issues of common moral concern. In our separate worship services, we can each make sure that we pray for our country. And not just for its leaders, as Catholic churches tend to, but for the actual country that we all share, for the United States of America. And then in our civic life, when we gather together as people of all faiths or no faith, we can still celebrate and reinforce the common ground that we do all share as Americans. Which is why the UD Politics Department gathers us once a year to say the pledge, recite all 4 verses of the national anthem, eat some Texas barbecue, sing even more patriotic songs, and celebrate our Constitution. Believe it or not, this is all part of what makes religious freedom possible in this country. So stay for a couple songs if you can, and grab another drink.